Welcome back everybody to part 3 of Turfgrass. In this video we're going to cover proper lawn care, how to deal with weeds, and how to properly fertilize a lawn for the best results. When we're talking about managing weeds in turfgrass, you have to remember that weeds love too much water, too much fertilizer. They really love bare spots in lawns because that gives them plenty of room to germinate, set down their roots, and really spread out. Weeds love it when you cut your grass too short, removing more than 1/3 of the leaf blade, or cutting it maybe 1 or 2 inches tall, because that gives them plenty of sunlight to germinate and grow big and strong. Weeds love little or no mulch, and they also love a lack of scouting by you. They really do well when you totally ignore them until they become so widespread and your lawn is overrun with weeds, then all of a sudden you go into panic. As you remember from our section on weeds, there are 3 different types of weeds. There's broadleaf weeds, which have netted veins and broad leaves. Not necessarily, some broadleaf plants can have fairly narrow leaves, so you can't necessarily go by that. You want to look at the veins, and they have netted veins. Grasses always have parallel veins, and then they normally have either rounded or flattened stems. And then the other group of weeds, sedges, they have parallel veins, 3 ranked leaves, and remember, when they get larger and start to send up a seed head, the stem is triangular. With herbicides, we have 2 major types. Pre-emergent herbicides, which is put down before the weed seed germinates and even starts to grow. It stops the weed from germinating and growing. And then post-emergent herbicides, which are used to control weeds that are already up and growing and being a problem in the lawn. Herbicides can also be differentiated by how selective they are. Non-selective herbicides kill basically everything you spray them on. An example of this would be Roundup or glyphosate type product. Whatever you spray it on is going to kill it. Selective herbicides are designed to kill only certain types of plants. So if you spray it on your lawn and it kills the weeds without killing the grass, that's exactly what you're looking for. So an example is 2,4-D, which kills only broadleaf weeds in Bahia, Bermuda, and zoysia grasses. Now, you wouldn't normally want to use 2,4-D in St. Augustine lawns because it could kill the St. Augustine grass. So you have to be very, very careful when choosing a selective herbicide that is going to kill what you want it to kill and leave what you want it to leave. Another example is atrazine, but if you read very closely, the label says that you cannot use it on certain cultivars of warm season grasses. There's certain cultivars of St. Augustine you're not supposed to use it on, and other types of warm season grasses that if you use atrazine on it, it may damage the grass. So herbicides are all labeled based on the type of weed that you're trying to kill and the type of grass that you're using it on. Now, of course, it makes sense to try to avoid or reduce the number of weeds coming into your yard and getting a foothold at the beginning. So you want to follow University of Florida recommendations, proper fertilization, proper mowing practices. All these different types of turf grass have an ideal height that you want to cut them at, and you need to follow that information closely. Proper irrigation practices. Too little water and your lawn may suffer, become thin, sections will die off and leave more room for weeds to come in. But on the other hand, too much water is only going to encourage certain weeds. A good example of this is dollarweed and St. Augustine grass. If somebody comes in and says they have a St. Augustine lawn and it's really overrun with dollarweed, they're watering too much, because dollarweed really loves it and really thrives in very wet areas. Out in nature, you would find it growing in a wet area or up along the pond. So that kind of gives you an idea of how important irrigation practices are for controlling certain types of weeds. And then you want to select the type of grass you're going to put in very carefully to make sure that it's the correct variety to use on that site. There are a lot of products available that are very effective at killing broadleaf weeds in a grassy lawn, but there's very, very few choices if you're trying to control a grassy weed in a grassy lawn. And if you think about this, it kind of makes sense. Broadleaf weeds and grassy weeds, or broadleaf plants and grassy plants, are biologically different. You can find a chemical that kills one without killing the other, but if you're trying to control something like common Bermuda, which is a grass, crabgrass, or torpedo grass in your grassy St. Augustine lawn, they're both grasses. It's going to be very, very difficult to find a chemical to kill one without killing the other one also. That's why there's so few choices if you're trying to kill just grassy weeds in your grassy lawn. So let's look at some cultural practices like irrigation, fertilization, and mowing that is really going to help reduce a lot of your weed problems and a lot of other problems. This is a very important first step to take. It's also an integrated pest management step as far as cultural practices go to try to grow a healthy lawn and still have it coexist very well with the environment. With irrigating turfgrass, it's much better to use fewer, longer irrigation events instead of trying to water your lawn every single day just a little bit. That doesn't work very well because the less frequent, longer irrigation will wet the soil much better, and it makes the roots try to grow deeper to reach that extra water that's just a little bit deeper. Every time you irrigate, you should put down approximately 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of water each time. If you put more water down than that, you're only wasting water because 1 inch of irrigation, whether it's rainfall or from an irrigation system applied to a very sandy soil, moves 12 inches through the soil profile. Your grass roots don't go down anywhere near 12 inches deep. So adding 1 inch of water to your lawn means a lot of wasted water. You're just pushing a lot of that water 1 foot deep where it's going to go well beyond the reach of the roots. And then don't water in the evenings or at night. When we talked about different diseases of turf and also other plantings, for example, you may have an irrigation system that not only waters your lawn, but it's also watering your hedges, your bushes, your trees, your ornamental plants. If you water late in the evening or at night, what you're doing is you're putting your yard to bed wet, and that's really going to encourage fungal diseases, which is very, very bad. So ideally, you're going to want to water your lawn very, very early in the morning. Pre-dawn is fine, but that way, as soon as the sun comes up, the sun will come out and dry off the grass blades, and that way your grass is not sitting there wet for too many hours. Some signs that your lawn may need to be watered. A lot of times the grass is going to change color a little bit from a nice even green to slightly bluish gray. If you look very closely, the leaf blades will fold in half lengthwise. They won't be sitting there flat anymore. Grasses will do that to try to conserve water. If you walk through the lawn and your footprints remain after you step on the grass and walk away from it, that means the grass is very dry. And then if you check by digging down and checking how wet or dry the soil is at the root zone, you'll see that it's very dry also. Now in Hernando County, we are under year-round watering restrictions that we're going to cover at length in the irrigation section. So we really don't have the option to go out there and water our lawn every single day because you will get in trouble with code enforcement. So we'll cover that much more in depth in the irrigation section coming up next week. So why would we want to fertilize our lawn? Well, if you remember from an earlier section on fertilizer, you only want to apply fertilizer for a reason. You're actually trying to get some type of response from the plant in question. So with grass, of course, fertilizer, if you add it, the grass will grow faster, it'll be greener, it will spread and fill in and become more dense. So turf does need to be fertilized, but you don't want to go out there and fertilize it just because it's April 1st or because your next door neighbor just did it. Turf grass does need a certain amount of nutrients to remain healthy. Some of those nutrients are naturally in the soil, such as phosphorus in our part of Florida, but some of the other nutrients you have to add as a fertilizer. So a properly fertilized lawn is one of the best defenses against weeds, stormwater runoff, and also diseases. So too much fertilizer is bad, and too little fertilizer can also be bad also. Here's a list of all the essential elements that are needed by plants. You'll see the ones in red are especially needed by most turf grasses. Obviously, as we covered before, most soils here in Hernando County have adequate amounts of phosphorus in them. So that's generally pretty well covered by your native soil. Of course, without having a soil test done, we don't know for sure whether your soil has enough phosphorus or not. But normally, you're going to use a turf fertilizer to add nitrogen, add potassium, which are both very important for healthy growing grass. Grass needs a certain amount of iron also, and sometimes manganese. When should you fertilize a lawn? Generally, it's better to fertilize it several times a year very lightly instead of once or twice very, very heavy. And here in Hernando County, we have a fertilizer ordinance which prohibits homeowners from fertilizing their lawns during the months of January, February, and March. So when we say that you want to start fertilizing your lawn in spring, we mean April 1st or after, because you're not allowed to fertilize your lawn January, February, or March. In summer, depending on how well your grass is growing, how green it is, how well it's doing, you may need to fertilize again. In fall, you want to fertilize for the last time of the year early in the fall, because once we get a little further into fall, your grass is going to start to go dormant, grow much slower, and it's going to take up much less nutrients. So in the fall, even if you fertilize with a slow release fertilizer, all that extra fertilizer is being released during the months of, let's say, November, December, January, is going to go somewhere. Your grass is not going to take it up that time of year because it's not actively growing. Only actively growing turf takes up nutrients. So what's going to happen to those nutrients? They're going to run off. They're going to leach through the sand. They're probably going to end up in the aquifer. Now, down in South Florida, they may be able to fertilize year round, but that really doesn't affect us. All these different grasses we've discussed so far are all warm season grasses, and they will all go dormant to a certain extent here during the winter. When a grass goes dormant, it grows very slowly. It's not taking up much water, and it's not taking up much in the way of fertilizers. So you don't want to fertilize too late in the fall, and definitely not during the winter. Here are some turfgrass fertilizer best management practices. That's what BMP stands for. And most of these different points here are already incorporated in the Hernando County Fertilizer Ordinance, which we'll discuss further. And you're going to see most of these different BMPs once again when you take your class on the green industry's best management practices. But generally, you want to keep fertilizer off of impervious surfaces. Those are surfaces the water cannot drain through, like your sidewalk, the street in front of your house, um, concrete blocks. You want to maintain a wide buffer zone around any water bodies. You want to apply the correct amount of fertilizer. Don't think that more is better, because with fertilizer that's not true. You want to know your pH and nutrient concentrations in advance by getting a soil test done. That way you know exactly what type of fertilizer to add and how much of it. You're able to fine tune your fertilizer program based on the information you get from a soil test. Generally, you want to use either a low phosphorus, or if you get a soil test done and you know that your lawn has very high amounts of phosphorus, you want to use a no phosphorus fertilizer, many of which are available now at the big box stores if you look closely. You only want to fertilize during the growing season, because you only want to fertilize actively growing turf, which is between spring and fall. And then you want to irrigate the fertilizer after you put it down with about a quarter inch of water after application. More information about this is going to be on the actual package of fertilizer you put down. They're generally going to call for you to irrigate after you fertilize, unless it's going to rain, and then the rainfall will take care of it for you, because many of these dry granular fertilizers need to be dissolved in water before they can go into the soil and actually work as a fertilizer. So go ahead and defer to the directions on the package, the fertilizer package for that. But as a general rule, if it's a dry granular fertilizer, you're going to want to put down about a quarter inch of irrigation after application. Here are some general guidelines for what fertilizer you want to choose for what situation. Generally, when you're fertilizing your turf, some of the nitrogen should be in slow release form, but this depends on, to a certain extent, on exactly when you're fertilizing your lawn. If you're fertilizing in the spring and part of the nitrogen is fast release and part is slow release, that's great. The fast release part of the nitrogen will dissolve and be available to your grass right away. That'll green it up, that'll get it growing in the spring. And the slow release component is going to last into summer. If you have to fertilize your lawn again in the summer, using part fast release and part slow release is going to work very well once again. The slow release nitrogen is going to be released over a period of time and fertilize your lawn for longer. But if you're fertilizing in the fall, you may want to look very closely at how much of the nitrogen is in slow release form, because if you're fertilizing in, let's say, October, and you read the package and the slow release nitrogen is going to last for 30, 60, or 90 days, that means that part of the nitrogen is going to be released in November, December, January, when your grass is dormant, not actively growing, and not really taking up the fertilizer. So maybe a better choice in the fall will be a very, very light application of fast release nitrogen, which is going to dissolve and be available to the grass immediately, be taken up by the grass while it's still growing, but not still be sitting around dissolving once we get into winter and your grass is no longer growing. You want to make sure the ratio of the nitrogen to potassium is at least 2 to 1 or higher, especially if the grass is under stress. Potassium is very good for turf. Now, an old standby formulation for turfgrass fertilizer is 16-4-8, which is 16% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 8% potassium. Now, if you take a soil test and you know that your soil has plenty of phosphorus in it, that middle number can and should ideally be 0. So finding something that's like a 16-0-8 would be a much better choice. But you see 16-0-8 is the 2 to 1 proportion between nitrogen and potassium. Potassium is good for grass. You want to be sure to apply some every time you fertilize. You really don't want to be fertilizing with just nitrogen, because that by itself will turn your grass green and make it grow quickly, but it's not providing all the nutrients that your turf is going to need. If you have a very high pH soil, if you remember from our module on fertilizers and fertilizer ions, some of the micronutrients might be tied up and not available to grass. So if in a high pH soil, you're going to want to use iron and manganese that's available in either a soluble form or a chelated form. If you decide to fertilize your lawn with an iron-only supplement during the summer, because what that can do is make your grass nice and green without making it grow really fast, like what would happen if you just added a lot of nitrogen to it, you need to buy the good iron and not the cheap iron. Iron comes in many different forms, some of which are plant available, other ones are not. So generally, for adding micronutrients to turf, you want to spend the extra money and get the chelated form, because many of the other forms are iron, but it's just not in a form that the turf can take up. Here are a couple slides that are taken from the Green Industries Best Management Practices program. When it comes to mowing cultural practices, you want to cut your grass as high as you can. Of course, you want to pick up sticks and stones and any other kind of debris that's going to damage your mower or cause an injury. You want to cut your grass at the highest recommended height for that species. You don't ever want to cut off more than 1/3 of the leaf blade at any one time. If you're late cutting your grass, it gets a little extra long. You don't want to get caught up by cutting it extra short. That's very, very damaging for your lawn. So here on the right hand side, we see the recommended heights for different types of grass. St. Augustine, the recommended height is 3.5 to 4 inches. Generally, you want to go 4 inches or higher. With St. Augustine, higher is better. Bahia is the same, 3 to 4 inches. You don't want to be cutting it at 1 to 2 inches. That's going to be very damaging for your grass, and long term, it's going to do really terrible things to your turf. Zoysia grass can be cut shorter, 2 to 2.5 inches, but like I've mentioned several times, we have very little in the county. Centipede grass grows up in North Florida, not so much an issue for us. Bermuda grass can be cut very short. If you think golf courses, putting greens, those are generally all Bermuda grass and is cut very, very short, but it's going to be very difficult to keep your lawn, your turf, looking like a putting green. Probably going to take more fertilizer and water and a whole lot more work than what you really want to put into it. But if you do have a lawn with Bermuda grass, it can be cut shorter. But what happens is if you cut it too short, you scalp it and the entire lawn turns a beautiful shade of brown for a few days till it starts to grow back in again. And of course, one of our FFL recommendations is that you leave the grass clippings, because if you have a decent mulching mower and the grass clippings are mulched up and left on the lawn, it adds a lot of nitrogen back into the soil and back into the grass. As a matter of fact, research has found that if you mulch your grass when you're cutting it, you can cut back your fertilization by about one fertilizing per year. The height that you cut your grass at also influences how deep the roots go. As a general rule, the more blade that the grass has above ground, the deeper it will make its roots below ground. So we want nice, long, deep roots that are going to go down and search out nutrients, search out water. That way your lawn doesn't have to be watered nearly as often. And we want nice, tall grass blades, evenly cut and cleanly cut, because that helps to shade out weeds. It helps the grass grow better, healthier. It's going to grow fuller. It's going to actually fill in the lawn and not leave weeds any room to come in and get established. Consistently cutting your turf too short or scalping it is probably the worst thing that you could do for your lawn. I've seen many lawns and spoken with many people, and I ask them how tall they cut their grass. They say, oh, I cut it 3 or 4 inches. They bring a sample in, I measure it, and it's about 1 inch tall. So make sure, if you have to go out there with a ruler to measure it and measure how high the blades are in your mower, then that's what you need to do. If you cut St. Augustine grass too short, week after week after week, within about 1 year, there's a very good chance you're going to kill your entire lawn. Of course, most homeowners don't believe that that's what did it. They think it's chinch bugs, they think it's disease, they think they didn't fertilize it enough. But trust me, the quickest way to kill a St. Augustine lawn is by consistently cutting it too short. It's also very important to keep your lawnmower blades sharp. You see the picture on the right here? These blades were cut with a dull lawnmower blade. You could tell very easily looking at a lawn whether the blades were sharp or not. If you look very closely at the blades of grass and where they were most recently cut, if it's a jagged cut like it is in this picture, the blades were dull. If the blades were sharp, it's a very nice clean cut like it was trimmed with a pair of scissors. So if you cut your lawn and the edges of the leaf blade are left jagged like this, that's an ideal way for fungal leaf spots to move into your turf. As a matter of fact, gray leaf spot almost always occurs in lawns where it's been getting cut with dull mower blades. If you ever look at a sample of turf, of St. Augustine turf that has the gray leaf spots on it, if you look at the blades, they're almost always jagged like the ones in this picture are here also. And of course, you want to use any kind of protective safety equipment that's called for by the manufacturer also. You always want to be safe when you're working out in the yard. I believe that's all we have for our turf section. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, email me, catch me in class, and thank you very much.